I'm delighted to open the evening session, Narratives of Conversion. And without further ado, I will ask the first speaker to begin. The first speaker is Karen Auerbach. She is an associate professor of history at the Department of History and Carolina Center for Jewish Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of The House of the Ujazdowskie 16, Jewish Families in Warsaw After the Holocaust, and editor of Aftermath, Genocide, Memory and History. Please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Batal, for the introduction. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Very
okay.
good. Loud and clear. Okay.
I'm going to thank you. I'm going to try to share a screen, but it doesn't seem to be coming up when I try to open it. So I'm just going to start. Okay. First, I wish we were all in person, but it's at least good to see names and some faces here. A week before Christmas in Warsaw in 1898, Alicja Leventhal, an 18-year-old Polish woman born to a Jewish family, had a confrontation with her mother about the crisis of religious identity with which Alicja Leventhal had been struggling for years. The night before, the daughter had become emotional when her mother's closest friend had announced that she and her son would soon be baptized as Catholics. The night after her outburst, as Leventhal described it in the diary she kept in those years, her mother demanded that her daughter make a decision. "Are you a Jew or a Catholic by confession?" asked her mother, who was a believing Catholic, according to her daughter's depiction, and was raising her children in the Catholic faith, but who had not yet formally converted. "I don't know what I am," Leventhal recorded in her diary as her response. "I just know that I believe in Jesus." 2 days later, her mother once more demanded that her eldest daughter make a choice, and again Alicja Leventhal expressed a blurred identity. She believed in Jesus and in prayer, she responded, but she did not profess to be either a Catholic or a Jew by religious confession. Her mother was angry at her response. She insisted that her daughter take down the picture of Jesus and the wooden cross that hung above her bed in her bedroom. Since her mother told her praying to Jesus was a profanation if she did not proclaim herself to be Christian. Alicja Leventhal was devastated. The previous year, she had been distraught when a Catholic suitor did not go through with a planned engagement, which she attributed to the stigma of her Jewish background. "He is not for me," she had written at that time. "I repeated to myself, you are a Jew, and he is a Catholic from a proud Volhynian family. You are not for him. They are Catholics, everyone is Catholic, so do not dream, do not believe," she continued. "Always remember that the world is not yours, that you are an intruder, that you alone are a Jew among all of these Catholics." And only months before her argument with her mother, her home had been a refuge for her to pray because she felt uncomfortable at church, where, according to her own recounting, she felt it necessary to sit in the pew behind her friend because she was not, as she referred to it, Catholic by birth. Now, even within her own home, she felt rejected. Alicja Leventhal was growing up in a home of mixed identities, and Jewish identity was at once present and ever absent and ever present in her life. Her father, Solomon Leventhal, was a notable Jewish publisher of Polish books and a leader in Jewish institutions, and her mother's father, Matthias Berson, was one of Warsaw's most prominent Jewish leaders. But her mother, Hortensia, had become a believing Catholic by the time her children were growing up, though she was not baptized until 1902, and she was raising Alicja Leventhal and her siblings in the Catholic faith. Leventhal's knowledge of Judaism was absent to such an extent that her belief in Jesus, in her own view, did not preclude her identification as a Jew. In her diary, which she kept at the turn of the century, the 20th century, she sought to make sense of the emotional fluctuations and questions of identity that transcend time and place for many a diarist her age. Yet she was also grappling with challenges specific to the world of a young woman of her background in Fantasiekla, Warsaw. Her life unfolded at the center of elite society by dint of her family's wealth and prominence, but her experiences were dominated by feelings of marginalization and alienation because of what she viewed as the stigma of Jewish background. Her ruminations about religion and belonging, interspersed in a narrative focused on mundane details of social life, convey a fractured identity on the margins of Catholic and Jewish, at the intersection of Polish and Jewish, resulting from the challenge that exclusionary Polish nationalism, as well as racial conceptions of anti-Jewish thought, posed to her self-identifications. Threading throughout her narrative of social and cultural life, romantic hopes and disappointments, longing for friendship, and growing disillusionment and alienation, were confusion over religious identity and uncertain about the meaning of her family's Jewish background for her own life. Jewishness was present mainly as a stigma for her, one that she must overcome, an identity imposed by others. Her disappointments in romance became inseparable from her increasing disillusionment at her desire to marry a man of Catholic and Polish aristocratic descent in order to leave behind what she viewed as the burden of Jewish heritage. She experienced ambiguities and contradictions in political ideas about national identity as uncertainty about where she belonged in her social world. So her diary provides access to a life history that is an example of the exceptional normal, to use Eduardo Grandi's term, a marginal individual whose experiences cast in sharp relief historical developments that shape society to greater or lesser degree more broadly. Her diary sheds light on the identifications and everyday lives of those who straddled the border of Polish and Jewish and Catholic and Jewish at a time when those borders were shifting. Whereas studies of Polish nationalism and its impact on Catholic-Jewish, Polish-Jewish relations have often focused on developments in politics, journalism, and other areas of public life, Leventhal's chronicle of her social world shifts the focus to the private realm. And here in my research in general, I'm building on Agnieszka Jagodzinska's research, on Todd Endelman's research, and on Ella Bauer's research. And it's good to see Ella here, at least her name on the side. How did individuals in their everyday lives understand and experience changing ideas about Polishness and evolving definitions of Pole and Jew? To what degree did racial ideology, that is modern racial anti-Semitism, influence everyday life and social relations? And how did these notions impact the paths of Jewish families that had adopted a Polish identification in earlier generations, with the expectation that this would lead to acceptance as part of the Polish national community? And I apologize for, I'm like looking off to the side, but I can't read from my computer directly. Okay. The significance of Leventhal's diary lies at the intersection of three issues in modern Jewish history. The role of gender in processes of assimilation, which I'll be focusing on today, the impact of Polish nationalism on Jewish life, and factors that lead to conversion as a form of radical assimilation. Historians who have traced attitudes toward Jews among Polish political figures, journalists, secular Polish intellectuals, and Catholic writers have emphasized the period from the early 20th century to the First World War as the key time frame in the consolidation of an exclusionary form of Polish nationalism, though historians' findings have differed over the extent to which racial ideas influenced anti-Semitism in both political rhetoric and Catholic thought in the Polish lands in those years. So by widening the historical lens to the private realm, Leventhal's diary reveals the impact of these shifts on everyday interactions. Her chronicle indicates that even before exclusionary notions of what it meant to be Polish gained wider traction in politics, Leventhal and her peers experienced the impact of these ideas in their social world. Her diary crystallizes the tension between religion and what was termed ethnicity in evolving definitions of the Polish nation. This tension was at the root of Leventhal's confusion over identity. So her diary is also a conversion narrative that reconstructs the final stage in her family's path from integration to baptism. Her chronicle expands our understanding of factors in both public and private life that influence identity change, including conversion in modern Jewish history. And I think identity change is what sort of the theme that runs through all of our papers on this panel. As Leventhal grappled with the impact of evolving definitions of the Polish nation on her own identity, the resulting alienation that characterized her path to baptism was heightened by her experiences as a woman searching for social acceptance. And in the time that I have today, this is what I will focus on the gender lens for this research. Among East European Jewish women for whom baptism was the culmination of assimilatory processes, as in the Leventhal family, and among those raised in traditional Jewish homes as well, women's paths to conversion were often connected with education, marriage, and social interactions with surrounding societies. Yet Leventhal's life complicates models of gender differences in processes of assimilation, including studies of conversion as part of the Jewish confrontation with modernity. Leventhal's experiences were the result of her parents' assimilation and reflect the tail end of a trajectory that occurred over 3 generations, underscoring the need to analyze the dynamics of assimilation as a multi-generational process. This is a history in which the public lives of parents intersected with the private lives of children. Leventhal's social life and cultural interests were shaped by her family's role in Polish culture and society. Her father's publishing work, together with her mother's social prominence, opened doors for Alicja Leventhal to literary events and social gatherings, where Polish writers and other cultural figures in attendance lent prestige to all those present. The Leventhals turned their own home into a venue of Polish cultural and social life, hosting a salon in their apartment, where their children encountered writers whose works Salomon Leventhal published. And I think the salons sort of also connects my work to Hanna Kozinska-Witt's work. No clear divide separated the private world of her home from the public sphere of cultural life. As Leventhal came of age, she was aware of her father's increasingly tenuous place in Polish cultural circles, despite the family's immersion in the social life of that milieu. In her childhood, Salomon Leventhal had become what Helena Datner referred to as the whipping boy of the Polish press, in polemics against Jewish owners of Polish periodicals, as some journalists criticized what they saw as the Judaization of the press and attacked Jewish publishers as leeches on the backs of Polish writers. Unlike her father and other Jewish publishers of Polish books who preceded him, who followed a path to Polishness above all, first in the public realm of economic life and then cultural life, it was mainly through the private sphere that Leventhal and her three sisters sought entrance into Polish society. And while her father found by the 1880s that his Jewish identity had become a liability to his public profile and professional success, Alicja Leventhal increasingly experienced her family's Jewish background as an obstacle to private fulfillment. She felt the pressure not only of her own hopes to leave behind the burden of Jewish background through marriage, but also of her parents' struggle for acceptance in Polish society, that is, Polish Catholic society. Leventhal herself had resigned herself to the possibility of marrying a Jewish man after a Catholic suitor had shied away from marriage. But when a man from a prominent Jewish family was prepared to ask her to marry him, her parents rejected him because his family was, quote unquote, too Jewish. Caught between her mother's hopes for Catholic sons-in-law and her own desire to avoid more disappointment, she became ever more alienated. Why are my parents not content with the Jewish circle of our world, she wrote in her diary. I would not have idealistic dreams about everything, because also among Catholics we are among the first tier, yet only to be treated as a toy. When it comes to more serious thoughts or conversations, the entrance closes and the church shouts, "Stand there, this threshold is not for you. I will not escape from being a Jew, I cannot, because I am accustomed to something else. No Catholic will want me, so I will be demoralized, an unneeded pawn. And then when I do not want to look at either Jews or Catholics, what will be then? I will remain alone, completely alone among the entire human mass." And Professor Bartal, if you can give me a sort of a heads up when I'm about 5 minutes remaining, that would be great, maybe in the chat. That would be
You
great.
have 10 minutes to go.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. When Hortensia Leventhal, Alizya's mother, eventually decided that her 4 daughters must marry into Catholic families, a decision that Salomon Leventhal, who was still a leader in Jewish institutions, apparently supported, and which one future son-in-law described as a desire for husbands with a quote-unquote Polish aristocratic last name ending with ski. Leventhal felt the pressure of her mother's desire for that most radical form of assimilation, full absorption into Polish Catholic society through conversion and marriage. And as a side note, Agnieszka Jagodzinska has thoroughly analyzed the legal, historical, and cultural context of first and last names in the processes of Jewish integration. I don't have time to get into that more. So in the first year of the 20th century, Alicja Leventhal underwent baptism in preparation for marriage to a Catholic man who had the proper ski ending. Yet her baptism was not only the fulfillment of a requirement for marriage. Formally embracing Catholicism was rather to adopt a religious identity that was entwined with what she viewed as a Polish heritage. But in the end, Leventhal never married her fiancé. The marriage was called off just days before the wedding. Later, she recounted comments he had reportedly made about her. "I am convinced that I was engaged to a woman of a different race from me," her fiancé had said. Another friend told him that it was good he had withdrawn from the quote-unquote assimilation of the races. The experience led to a devastating realization that she could not decode the rules of belonging, and that the terrain of identity, Polish, Jewish, and Catholic, were shifting beneath her. And I should say the rules of belonging and the terrain of identity, in case I referred to that incorrectly. Historians' findings about the role of gender in the processes of Jewish assimilation illuminate the phenomenon of conversion as a path of radical assimilation. Levinthal's path does not fit neatly into what Paula Hyman referred to as Western versus Eastern models of the role of ideas about gender, to cite her, in the construction of Jewish identity in the modern period. In Eastern Europe, as she and Iris Parush found, the neglect of formal religious education for girls in traditional Jewish communities meant they were more likely to receive an education that exposed them to literature and non-Jewish languages and other influences, transforming them into agents of assimilation. And Professor Shaul Stamfer has had different findings about this issue that I don't have time to get into right now. It is in some ways an inversion of the role of women in maintaining Jewish rituals in the home in the Western model, what Marian Kaplan termed domestic Judaism in the context of 19th century Germany. Now, education in non-Jewish languages was a factor in the path to conversion, not only among acculturated upper-class women such as Hortensia and Alicia Leventhal and her sisters. In Galicia, in the last decades of the 19th century, Rachel Manakin has argued, education in Polish primary schools for girls instilled Polish patriotism in students through an emphasis on Polish language and culture, establishing an important context for higher rates of conversion among Jewish women who grew up in traditional middle and lower class Jewish homes in villages and small towns. And there are other aspects of Professor Manakin's research that are relevant here. While historians' findings on gender and conversion and assimilation shed light on Levinthal's path, her experiences also diverged from that research. Her Jewish education was neglected not mainly because of her gender. Her brother, too, received a thoroughly secular education in non-Jewish languages, but because her mother raised Alicia and her siblings in the Catholic faith long before the family's baptism. The bourgeois cult of domesticity, on the other hand, which turned Jewish women into bearers of Jewish tradition in the Western model, according to Paula Hyman, of gender differences in assimilation, that cult of domesticity had the opposite impact in the Levinthal's case. It was her mother's thank you, that had a greater impact on Alicia and her siblings' upbringings and education, facilitating, not putting a brake on the family's assimilation. Leventhal bore the burden of her parents' determination to break free of the Jewish circles of their world through their daughters' marriages. And the memoirist Anna Leo has similar reflections as Alicia Leventhal does about her life. Anna Leo has a similar reflection about their common social world. It is above all the experience of alienation that is central to understanding Alicia Leventhal's emotional makeup and mindset shaping her path to conversion. For Leventhal, it was her very status at the center of Polish society that forced her to confront the limits of social acceptance. And that's why I think she, as a marginal individual, reflects broader developments in a way that perhaps the majority of the rest of the Jewish population, the sort of more common characteristics of Jewish life, don't reflect to the extent that her life does. Her parents' access to the world of Polish cultural life and high society seemed for a time to allow their children to overcome social divisions between Jewish and Catholic societies. But adoption of a Polish cultural identity did not turn out to be sufficient for families such as the Leventhals to erase the mark of difference. Even formal entry into the Catholic community of faith, which Leventhal herself viewed as a definitive, that is, Alicia Leventhal herself viewed as a definitive departure from her Jewish background, did not allow her to escape from an identity as the other, which the ideology of race imposed on her. And here, there's a distinction between ethnicity and race, but one of the issues I'm grappling with is how people at the time made distinctions between these two conceptions. The uncertain meaning of Jewishness and Catholicism for Alicia Leventhal reflected the confusion of elements and ideologies that continue to mark her and her family as different. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Anna Kozinska-Witt from Rostock. She is a historian specializing in the history of East Central Europe. She published on Ludwig Gombrowicz, Jewish Integrationalism in Krakow, Municipal Networks, City Competitions, housing politics, tourism, and Jewish deputies in municipal councils in interwar Poland. Professor Witt is an author of 4 monographs, numerous articles, and many reviews. Professor Witt, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm not professor. I'm only a very little doctor.
Well, in Israel, the term professor means something different from Europe and the United States, as you probably know. I didn't say that you are Professor Doctor.
Okay. I don't well, see.
This is part of the difference between Germany and Eastern Europe.
Okay, I see my presentation, and I would like to present the story of a Jewish family whose members all converted. This family is mentioned in the works about economic Jewish elite in Warsaw, for example, by Cornelia Aust, Glenn Dinner, and by historians of so-called Warsaw School. And I owe also a lot to the works about conversion by Todd Edelman. First, I would like to shed light on the family colligation in general, and later I will devote to the special attention to the women of the family. My story begins with Meyer Baruch from Königswar in Bohemia, who came to Podgórze as an imperial official to control the salt trade from Wieliczka. Podgórze, actually Józefstadt, was a small town on the Vistula River opposite Kraków. Since it was a new entity, it enjoyed many freedoms that the old town did not offer. There was enough space and many mineral resources there, for example, clay and gypsum. That is why new companies settled there, and Meyer offered a good figure and was married to the daughter of the local wholesaler who cooperated with Warsaw trading elite, Israel Mendelssohn. The daughter was Eva. Meyer Baruch represented a type of immigrant, the foreign German acculturated Jew who went from the west to the east, and in the 20s he repeatedly tried to move to Kraków as a so-called civilized Jew. We know nothing about Eva except that she was very rich and her family had contacts with the Warsaw merchant elite via the salt trade. On the basis of Eva's last will, we can reconstruct the family, 2 brothers and 3 daughters. The first son, Hermann, has studied law and became a civil negotiator, which certainly helped the second, Moritz Mauricy, to run the family business. The 2 daughters were respectably married. One, Maria Marianna, to Ignacy Neumark from Warsaw, who was one of the most powerful merchants and suppliers of the various armies, and the second, Carolina, to the Austrian colonel, which visualizes the relations of the family not only to the imperial officers, but also to the military. Both characteristics are known from the Kingdom Poland, and there is no traces to the 3rd daughter, Adalberta. So here, and another, it's, moment, perhaps I can make it, not, I can't make, okay. And here we have the geography of the marriages of the 2nd generation. It is significant that while the first generation remained with Judaism and called its civilized option their own, the second generation all converted. Maurycy was accused of not being interested in his confession and of remaining close to the affairs of the Jewish community, for example, for each charity. It is difficult to discern a pattern in the conversions. While the older brother and both his sister became Catholic, the younger brother, associated with the businesses, became Lutheran. While Catholic conversion were relatively early, Maurycy did not convert until the day before death, with his wife first remaining Mosaic and only becoming Lutheran at her deathbed a few years later. The conversion ensured pompous burial ceremonies and dignified burial places for Maurycy family members. It is on the right. It is the tombstone in Rakowiecki Cemetery, also very noble. The conversion of the next generation, Maurycy's children, who took the family businesses, seem even more complicated. Next. While the firstborn Emil became Lutheran before his father's conversion in 1855, Gustav waited until 1885 to take this step. I tend to look for the practical reasons in the individual lives of the converts. For Emil, it was his career in banking, where in the 50s there was still a confessional quota, and he would not have been admitted as a second Jew to the function of the bank censor. Emil maintained friendly relations with the Lutheran congregation, had even become its presbyter, also elder, and was friend with yet another outstanding Lutheran in Krakow, the city president and secretary of the Krakow Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Ferdinand Weigel. For the younger brother, Gustav, on the other hand, the reason for his conversion to Lutheranism was rather the future marriage of one of the daughters, Róża, who married Catholic a few months after the conversion in 1885. Since Emil's wife, Róża Lord, was already Catholic when she married in the 60s, and Gustav's wife and children converted to Catholicism, we have here an interesting pattern. The man became a Lutheran, the woman Catholic. The children of Emil and Róża, despite their Catholic mother, became Lutheran, according to their father. The children of Gustav, despite having a Lutheran father, became Catholic. Who were these women who followed their husbands to Podgórze? The geography of marriages of the third generation. We have little information about Maurycy's wife, Anna Panowka from Wrocław. She is not listed on the family tomb in Rakowiecki Cemetery. In any case, there was an acculturated Panowka family in Wrocław, which provided the officials of the Jewish community there, but it is not known whether Anna was descended from it. One of the famous Wrocław Panowkas, the musician Heinrich, wrote in one of his letters that he was visiting his family in Kraków, so it's possible that they were from one family. Be that as it may, Anna was a respectable local personality, as her death was reported in Kraków daily newspaper Czas. The least known is Matilda Joelsson, wife of Gustav. We only know that she came from Mochylów Podolski and often spent the summer months in Karlowe Vary or Marienbad. She was the only one of a family who stayed in Podgórze and lived there also between the two world wars. Only Emil's wife, Róża Lord, becomes a little better known thanks to the writing of her children. In any case, it is a well-bred lady, a representative of bourgeois culture. She pursued music and gardening, loved literature. Her father, Joseph Lord Sr., fought in the revolution of 1848 in Hungary, was afterwards a very successful businessman in Slovakia, and eventually wrote several books and articles on the revolution and other issues. He was only one of the German acculturated Hungarian patriots. Rosa's sister-in-law, Valerie Rord, came from the Viennese noble Jewish family von Jacobi and was a true Viennese lady. Rosa Baruch was certainly much wealthier than average Kraków lady. She was very proud of her ancestry and constantly emphasized that she was from the Lord family. None of three women became involved in their husbands' businesses. Their homes were their knightdoms. Convention also allowed philanthropic and social activities. Female presence allowed visualization of men's high status in local society. Since Orthodox Jewish community did not offer them, the women, an opportunity to represent themselves, and the just burgeoning progressive milieu was weak and relatively insignificant, and no Jewish salons existed in Kraków. Only the established Christian bourgeoisie provided an appropriate arena. Baruch men were present in the local and trans-regional economic politics, as they were involved in the Kraków Chamber of Commerce and Industry and in the State Railway Council and various imperial commissions on food production. Now, however, the Kraków Chamber did not organize balls or charitable festivities. Even in Vienna and in Lviv, there were industrial balls only in the 20s and not in the 90s. There were gatherings on the occasion of trade exhibitions attended by the businesses, but female presence was not mentioned in the reports. Baruchs had good contacts with the local military commanderies. Kraków was a fortress, which also organized gatherings. By Baruch women are not mentioned in those reports either. That is why social life in Kraków seems to be dominated by the aristocracy and later by intelligentsia. At first, they met privately in their own houses and did not tolerate newcomers there. The situation changed in the second half of the 19th century when the bourgeois social life began to be redesigned. The city elite organized balls with charitable or patriotic purpose. They tried to invite all important personalities, especially respectable ladies were designed as hostesses. Since Baruch women were very wealthy, they were expected to make a large contribution or donation in kind. That the women served as a counterpart to their husbands and their presence visualized success and social position is demonstrated by the way they are named in the reports. The women lost their first names and were named after their husbands Emilova or Gustavova Baruch. And now to examples. First one, it is a ball on behalf of the monuments for Adam Mickiewicz, and we see Emilova Baruchova, the only one representative of the economic elite among aristocracy and intelligentsia. We have also men here. Gustav Baruch was the host, and Albert Mendelsburg, he was the head of the Jewish community and the head of the local chamber for industry and trade. And two converts from outside, one Konrad Berenson, bankier from Warsaw, and Dr. Rappaport, he was deputy for the Venice parliament. And the second one, here it is the Gustavova Baruchova and two another converts, Leonova Blumenstokova, the wife of the medicine and professor of the Jagiellonian University, and Józefowa Rosenblatova. He is the wife of the lawyer and also professor of the university. Unlike aristocratic ladies who could often condense their blue blood by their maiden name, the reporters never mentioned that Róża came from the Lord family. That is why I think, although it was acknowledged that the family achieved respectable prosperity and acquired high culture, the upper class bourgeois imperial connections were considered insignificant in Kraków. The women were invited as long as their husbands lived and worked, and as long as they were successful. In the case of Róża Baruch, her presence ended with the death of Emil. In the case of Matilda, with the accusation of her husband, which led to the bankruptcy of the company. Róża and all her children left Kraków and moved to Vienna, where they engaged, it seems successful, in artistic and social activities. However, the disgrace into which Matilda fell after the bankruptcy was not eternal. It did not affect her daughters. In contrast to the cases described by Todd Edelman for Warsaw, they found very respectable Catholic husbands and now participated in the social life under new name. Therefore, I wonder whether the conversion from the female perspective of Baruch women were really unsuccessful. And this is the question mark on the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now for our third speaker this evening, Professor Kalman Weiser, who is a Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish History, Modern Jewish Studies at York University and Interim Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Among other works, he is the author of Jewish People, Yiddish Nation, Noach Prilutsky and the Folkist in Poland, 2011, and co-editor of the recently published Key Concept in the Study of Anti-Semitism, 2021. He is currently writing a book about the careers of Jewish language scholars, Max Weinreich and Solomon Birnbaum, and their relationship with German Yiddish scholars who served the Third Reich. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be taking a bit of a different tack. I'm hoping that my images can appear. I'm going to be speaking about how Max Weinreich, the famous Yiddish scholar, the head of YIVO, became Max Weinreich. That is the earliest period of his life. What you see in front of you, the first image, is, of course, Max Weinreich in the second row in the white shirt with the YIVO Aspiranten in the late 1930s. And this is the man that we know. What I'll be talking about today is his path toward becoming this man. So let me begin. In June of 1923, 29-year-old Max Weinreich received his doctorate from the University of Marburg in Germany. His dissertation about the history of Yiddish research earned him stellar praise from his supervisor and the evaluators. As a star student, Weinreich might have been expected to pursue a conventional academic career path, working in the shadow of his supervisor for years and advancing by dint of hard work and tremendous patience to the coveted position of professor of German philology, despite the obstacle of being Jewish. But Weinreich chose not to remain in Germany, where he had resided for nearly 4 years amidst Berlin's widely emigre Yiddish-speaking cultural scene. Writing to Ab Kahn, editor of the New York Daily Vorwärts, he emphasized his desire to, quote, move home to Vilna in the fall, to move aheim to Vilna. Significantly, Weinreich placed aheim in quotation marks. He neither attended gymnasium in Vilna, as the biographical sketch in his dissertation asserts, nor was it his Heimatstadt, his hometown, as he claimed there, at least not in a literal sense. Weinreich had only lived in Vilna for about a year prior to coming to Germany in the fall of 1919. And that year included hiding out for days during a pogrom when Polish legionnaires entered the city, followed by months of sporadic harassment of Jews. Hardly events to inspire positive associations with the city in a newcomer. Given Weinreich's reputation for precision, it is hard to imagine that these biographical assertions were casual errors. Weinreich did not mean to claim Vilna as the city in which he was born or raised. Rather, Vilna was his adoptive city, one that exerted an irresistible attraction on him throughout his life and played an important role in the construction of his identity as a public figure. Today, I would like to explore aspects of Max Weinreich's early biography, a subject that has received little attention, to gain insight into how a son of the German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie in a small town in the Baltics became Dr. Max Weinreich, the Bundist and eminent Vilna Yiddishist. Weinreich's path to Vilna sheds light not only on the history of the city and the Yiddishist movement, but invites us to reflect on the relationship between language and identity among Jews in the modern era. In particular, it reminds us of the often overlooked place of German as a native language in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, a region most associated with internecine struggles between supporters of Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, and Russian. That Weinreich was not raised in Yiddish is in itself not wholly surprising, given the history of language ideologists in the region who were raised in languages and cultures other than those that they championed as the authentic language of their people. This includes many heroes of the Yiddish cultural movement, among them Nathan Birnbaum, the chief organizer of the landmark First Yiddish Language Conference in Czernowitz in 1908, Ber Bolochov, the Polei Zion theoretician and pioneering Yiddish philologist, and Vladimir Medem, the so-called Goy, because he was raised a Christian before he became the head of the Bund. Their outsider's perspective afforded them an appreciation of the language and its culture, seldom available to those who had acquired them without special effort. All acquired Yiddish as adults in the pursuit of their political ideals and became enamored of it. Their non-native ability in the language was at times a subject of amusement, if not derision, among critics, but it was more often a source of pride among followers who appreciated that speakers of prestigious languages such as Russian or German had made the effort to master the language of the folk. Others, such as the writer Shin Ansky, the linguist Nochem Stift, and the folkist leader Noah Prilutsky, rediscovered, in quotation marks, their native Yiddish after initial political or cultural activity in Hebrew and or Russian. Common to all such national penitents, however, was a tendency to celebrate themselves or to be celebrated by their admirers for their path to Yiddish in published interviews or writings offering inspirational narratives about their metaphorical homecoming to their people. Weinreich, in contrast, authored no conversion or homecoming narrative, no text explaining the process of enlightenment and internal transformation that led him to Yiddish and the Yiddishist cause. He was extremely private and publicly revealed few details about his personal life, especially about his family and his childhood. On the other hand, what he does reveal in scattered remarks in published writings prior to 1923 seems to reflect a conscious effort to distance himself from his geographic, linguistic, and class origins. In fashioning his public persona, the young Weinreich in some ways resembles a Baal Tshuva, or returnee to traditional Jewish practice, who has adopted a new manner of speech and seeks to de-emphasize his disquieting past in order to facilitate acceptance into new social circles. What I'm showing you here is Solomon Birnbaum and Nathan Birnbaum, who were true Baal Tshuvas, who formed the most interesting parallel because they also went to a similar path to accepting Yiddish. But I don't have details, but I would like to point out that this phenomenon is not simply Weinreich, it goes beyond Weinreich. As an ardent secularist, Weinreich placed his faith, of course, not in the God of Israel, but in the redemptive power of socialism and the Yiddish language. Only when he was already in his 60s and the world of his childhood no longer existed, was he perhaps comfortable enough to speak in an interview in the Yiddish press about his parental home in his native town in today's Latvia, some 400 kilometers northwest of Vilna. And this is, of course, what you can see on the picture here that I'm going to talk about. His hometown of Kuldinga, as it's in Latvian, Goldingen in German, or Goldingen in Yiddish. And that's his home in the middle, his childhood home. Meir Lazarovich Weinreich, as he was known in school documents, spent his earliest years not in the infamous Pale of Settlement that was home to the Tsarist Empire's largely impoverished Yiddish-speaking masses. Rather, Max, as he was known since childhood, was born the youngest of 10 children in a merchant family in the Russian province of Courland in 1894. Jews made up close to a quarter of the population of his literal hometown of Goldingen, or Kuldiga, which numbered about 10,000. His father, Lazar, a hardware store owner on the town's main street, and his mother, Sophia, or Shifra, had grown up in traditionally religious, presumably Yiddish-speaking homes, but they were not religiously scrupulous in their adult lives and had adopted German, as was the norm among the aspiring Jewish middle class in the second half of the 19th century, in this region long dominated by Baltic Germans. Yet, as in the case of other pioneering Yiddish scholars raised in homes where Yiddish was not the dominant tongue, the language was not wholly foreign to him either. Max Weinreich encountered Yiddishized German as well as the Courland Yiddish dialect, especially among the poorer classes and the older generation of local Jews. No doubt, however, he was raised to regard Yiddish with a measure of embarrassment or even condescension, as was common among so-called better classes of Jews. The Weinreich family was not without means, but it could not afford schooling for all of its children. It made special efforts to provide its brilliant son with a classical education, sending him to the gymnasium attended by the children of the local German elite, after he completed a modernized cheder that taught traditional religious subjects in addition to the rudiments of a secular education. According to varying accounts written about him, but not by him, he was motivated to leave Goldingen in 1908 at the age of about 14 as a result of his encounter with anti-Semitism in the gymnasium, the change in its language of instruction from Russian to German in 1906, or his disappointment with the quality of education that it provided. Most likely a combination of factors was at play, and it is conceivable that the overlapping of class and ethnic differences with anti-Semitism contributed to the profound ambivalence he would feel toward bourgeois German culture throughout his life. Living with relatives first in Vinsk and in Łódź, Weinreich studied privately for admission to a Russian language gymnasium. In 1909, he enrolled in a private Jewish gymnasium in St. Petersburg, where he studied general and Jewish subjects at a reduced rate in recognition of his financial difficulties. Weinreich's path to Yiddish began, however, in his native town through his friendship with a politically engaged boy from a working-class family following the 1905 Russian Revolution. It led him to join activities on behalf of the Bund, the Jewish Workers' Party. The Marxist Bund was one of the first Jewish parties to champion Yiddish as the national language of the Jewish masses. It recognized in the treatment of Yiddish, which was demeaned and hounded in the Russian Empire, a reflection of the treatment of its speakers. Weinreich became the Bund's enthusiastic supporter and propagandist for years to come. But it was really Yiddish that exerted an irresistible, lifelong fascination on him. He adopted a variety of Lithuanian Yiddish, different from the spoken Yiddish of Courland, and chose to identify with Yiddish speakers for the remainder of his life, even going so far as to identify Yiddish occasionally as his native language on legal documents and grant applications once he was an established scholar. To be sure, Weinreich had effectively attained native competence in the language, even if he was occasionally accused of the artificiality of his academic Yiddish in later years. As a native German speaker, he was particularly sensitive to differences between the languages. His dogged opposition to literary borrowings from modern German, so-called Dachmerisch, is legendary among Yiddish scholars. By age 13, Weinreich was penning articles in defense of Yiddish and about Jewish and general politics in the Tsarist Empire for Bundist publications in Russian and Yiddish, in addition to the liberal German language press in the Baltic region. And you see some examples of that here. In them, he condemned the lack of national feeling among the Jewish bourgeoisie in Courland, its admiration for the nobility and disdain for the peasantry, and its snobbish penchant for Germanization. He did not mention Goldingen by name, describing it rather as the shtetl where he happened to be present, but it seems quite clear that he had this town in mind and likely his own family for criticism. A few years later, we find the 16-year-old Max Weinreich looking forward to a time, as he wrote, quote, when assimilation will die its natural death and will no longer divert Jewish children from Yiddish culture and the Jewish people, end quote. The theme of linguistic assimilation appeared frequently in his writings for years to come. Often he decried socially aspiring Jews, particularly women, which is of course a theme that touches with what we've heard in the previous two talks about gender. He often decried socially aspiring Jews, particularly women, for preferring to speak languages other than Yiddish in public, an activity rendered laughable by their pronounced Yiddish accents in Russian and French that betrayed their origins. His insistence on speaking Yiddish as much as possible was considered fanatical by some, irritating even some other Yiddishists. Unlike many Yiddish writers who raised their children in languages other than Yiddish, Weinreich would later conduct his home life in Vilna with his wife, a native Russian speaker, fluent in German, exclusively in Yiddish. Okay, this is just some photos of his family life. I'll come back to them. In 1912 to 1917, Weinreich studied history, classics, and German philology at the University in St. Petersburg or Petrograd. During these years, he was active as a Bundist student group and forged relationships with like-minded peers, some of whom would later contribute to the foundation of YIVO in 1925. Following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, he left behind the deprivations and dangers of revolutionary Petrograd for Vilna, a center of traditional and, since the mid-19th century, modern Jewish culture and politics. Given the present-day mystique surrounding Vilna as the capital of Yiddishland, as world headquarters of YIVO in the interwar period, it is tempting to assume that the allure of Yiddish alone drew Weinreich there. However, no YIVO yet existed in 1918, and the provincial city, itself impoverished and battered by war, was swollen with refugees, and its political future was uncertain. But Vilna was the birthplace of the Bund in 1897, whose newspaper he had edited during the war years. Moreover, the city had undergone a cultural efflorescence during its occupation by German forces beginning in 1915. Occupying authorities reversed Russian imperial policy by recognizing minority languages previously restricted by Tsarist officialdom, granting greater freedom to the Yiddish press and theater. They also permitted Yiddish and Hebrew as the language of instruction in co-educational elementary schools now mandated by law. Not only was speaking Russian in public discredited because of its association with the Tsarist regime, large numbers of Russian-speaking Jewish intellectuals had fled into the empire's interior with retreating troops. In the emerging contest for the city's political future between the various nationalities represented in the city and its environs, Jewish cultural and political figures were increasingly motivated to support Yiddish as Jews' language and to make use of it in public assemblies and institutions. They could thus bolster claims to the right to national cultural autonomy for Jews, as well as avoid taking overt sides in the conflict between national groups. Jewish schools that previously taught in Russian now taught in Yiddish. And while Jewish intellectuals continued to speak Russian behind closed doors, they now spoke Yiddish publicly, as did most of the Jewish population of all social classes. In Vilna, Weinreich continued to edit a Bundesorgan, as well as began to co-edit and contribute to the Vilna Yiddish daily Der Tog, founded by the committed Yiddishist Zalman Rezen, who exerted a profound influence on him. He was also elected to the board of the Jewish community in the spring of 1919. Despite the deprivations and dangers of wartime, the city's bustling Jewish intellectual and cultural ferment, which drew from throughout the Vilna region, no doubt proved intoxicating to Weinreich. Among the local personalities with whom Weinreich closely collaborated in building Yiddish cultural institutions was Tzemach Shabbat, a respected physician and venerated communal figure in whose apartment he lodged. And you can see him in the photo on the left, the man with the white hair. Their closeness was no doubt accelerated by Weinreich's budding relationship with Shabbat's daughter Regina, whom Weinreich would subsequently marry in 1920. Regina, you see on the left, and their two children, Uriel and Gabi, you see with Max on the right.
Wait a minute.
Weinreich's attraction to Vilna only grew during his years as a student at the universities of Berlin and Marburg from 1919 to 1923. Despite German being his mother tongue, he was decidedly not a German Jew and felt most at home among fellow Jewish students and refugee intellectuals from Eastern Europe in Berlin's Charlottenburg district. In his writing, in his reporting as a European correspondent for the New York Vorwärts, Weinreich expressed great ambivalence toward the country and its culture. Above all, he admired its socialist leaders and its academics' commitment to methodical scholarship, but disdained their frequent anti-Semitism and penchant to, quote, stuff students' heads with blind hatred and nationalist fanaticism, end quote. He wrote of his delight in returning for holidays to Vilnichke, to Vilna, with its picturesque hills, aggressive Jewish draymen, and persistent Jewish beggars. For Weinreich, Vilna was not only the ideal city for the fulfillment of his Yiddishist aspirations, it was also, he optimistically argued, a model for Polish-Jewish coexistence, despite his awareness of anti-Semitism there too. It was foremost a Polish city, since the majority of its population identified as Poles. But it was also a Jewish city, he explained, since Jews made up nearly 40% of the population, a larger proportion than in much bigger Warsaw, and because Vilna possessed a centuries-old Jewish presence. Local Poles, he maintained, understood and respected Jews' rootedness and cultural uniqueness. Here, he boasted in 1922, Polonization was virtually unknown among Jews, and support for Yiddish secular schools was strong, much stronger than the Polish cities of Warsaw and Łódź. In short, pursuing an academic career in a country where he felt a stranger was never really an option for Weinreich, despite feeling what he described as, quote, love mixed with pity, end quote, for Germany. The relative physical security offered by Berlin and the stimulation offered by its transient Eastern European intellectual community was no match for the sense of belonging to a small, cohesive community dedicated to a common purpose that he found in Vilna. The city was located on the political and economic periphery of a now independent Poland, but it offered in many ways more favorable conditions for the creation of institutions of secular Yiddish culture than large and politically factious Warsaw, with its class of Polonized Jews and large population of Hasidim, who were hostile to secular Yiddishist ideology. Weinreich's time spent in Germany was a means to an end. It enabled him, among other things, to acquire the linguistics training and access to libraries that would serve as ambition to research the history of the Yiddish language and fashion Yiddish into a tool of modern scholarship. It also provided him a coveted German Doktortitel that would garner him respect and virtually unquestioned authority in secular Yiddish circles in Eastern Europe. These factors would prove indispensable in his activities as a pedagogue in Vilna's Yiddish schools and in helping to found and operate YIVO. Nonetheless, despite identifying publicly as a Yiddisher Yid, a Yiddish-speaking Jew from Eastern Europe, Weinreich carried German language and culture, as well as the bourgeois values of his childhood milieu, with him throughout his life. This was apparent not only in his reverence for academic titles and his rigorous approach to critical scholarship, but also in his language planning efforts, for which the standardized German language served Yiddish as a model for both emulation and dissimulation. And finally, his most private life, German remained the language of intimacy with Kurland-born relatives and some close friends, even after the Holocaust turned his ambivalence toward German culture into rage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the three speakers for your well-researched and thought-provoking papers on the narratives on conversion and belonging. Listening to the talks, I thought to myself that conversion has not led those who converted to belonging, or better put as a question, has conversion ever led to belonging? In the eyes of the critical historian, belonging, which is the title of our session, or part of the title, was or is, in the eyes of the beholder, both for the one who aspires for belonging or for the target collective, be it real or imagined, of this aspiration. And I would like very briefly to mention 5 points that are common to all papers, one way or the other, and then have a few comments on each of the papers. And by the way, as Kalman said, we have here a group of 2 and a group of 1, to put it ironically. That is, we have 3 cases of Jews opting for alternative identities. However, 2 of them have to do with religion or kind of religious identity or religious definition, if I put it in a more correct manner, while the 3rd one is kind of ideological, ideational, it has to do with ideology and politics. Still, there is much in common, and that's due to the 5 brief points that I would like to mention. First of all, it turns out from all 3 papers, something that historians of Eastern Europe has known for several generations, that integration in Eastern Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, but in this case, mainly in Eastern Europe, had to do with opting for several cultures, for several languages, for several kinds of belonging, for several kinds of identities. And it was kind of an open-ended story that had to had kind of different endings. And for example, the case of Max Weinreich, you can see that he could end, anywhere in terms of the several options. But still, also with the Polish specific cases we had in the other two papers, it also was kind of an optional decision. Let me just mention the case in the paper of Dr. Witt, that is the option of converting to Lutheran Christianity or to Catholicism. And I would love to learn a little bit more what determined this kind of option. I know something of that case in the Russian Empire, for example, where many converted Jews opted for Lutheranism in the Russian Empire. So there were for sure all kinds of sociological, political, non-religious considerations. Now, also options of integrations were simultaneous, and people could opt simultaneously for 1, 2, 3, or 4 parallel options that played together at the same time, which meant that we are dealing here with cases of hybrid identity. That is, you cannot divorce one identity from the other, which explains, for example, this kind of, semi-Jewish, supposedly Polish, semi-Catholic, semi-religious Jewish, because they could go together in the eyes of the critical historian, of course. This is something that rabbis would not love to hear, but historians and sociologists are used to that in modern Jewish history. Now, the third thing, which is highly important here, and it repeats itself in all the papers, is the issue of class, social class, and belonging. I was very interested by the issue of Polish nobility as a target for integration and the impossibility, actually, of this thing to take place. And actually, I think that this issue between bourgeois culture or bourgeois society in Eastern Europe and nobility can explain much of the, if you like, frustration of those who wanted to belong. And I could say much of that, but this is not the issue. And the fourth point is the place or the role of the city, of urban life. In many ways, all the three cases we are dealing with had to do with moving in a generational, if you like, process. We are talking of 3 generations sometimes, moving from the small place to the big place and having to do with city, and in the case of Krakow, also with the metropolis, with the imperial metropolis, which is beyond the Polish environment in which those people who wish to integrate lived, but they were actually choosing all kinds of other options. Probably the imperial one had to do with the fact that the Austrian one was more open than the Polish one in many ways. And last but not least, of course, is the issue of gender and acculturation. And now, allow me, I pick up 1 or 2 issues of each of the papers in the order of the presentations. I found very interesting Karen's observations on the diary, Leventhal's diary, that shift the focus of our interest from the political, ideological, or if you like, even media, press, communication, to private life and individual experience. I think this is a major contribution to our understanding of the issue of integration, acculturation, conversion, due to the fact that this is kind of an ego document that adds much to our understanding. And as a matter of fact, it challenges some of the commonplace, conventional wisdoms about integration. And also her observation on the fact that the path taken by, or not taken, if you like, you can use both words, by the writer of the diary that do not fit the Orient or East and West models of assimilation, in which she challenges, again, some of the scholarship on the issue of integration. As for the paper of Dr. Witt, I found very interesting this interesting discussion of the generational process and the gradual movement, if you like, to a kind of a more radical, supposedly integration. However, I found much more interesting, again, this issue of imperial network. I think this is something that has to be taken more seriously by scholars who are dealing with Jewish modernization. We call it today the imperial turn. So it should be also considered in terms of the options or the social and political and cultural choices made by people who integrated into other groups. And as a matter of fact, it changes much our understanding of all those conventional terms such as assimilation, because in what way can one assimilate when he lives in one city, in a society in which he really wants or to be part of it, such as the Polish, upper class group, and ends up in integrating elsewhere in a place where he could do it better. And by the way, some of this we find also in the previous paper. And now going for the paper by Kalman, I think that two statements you made in your paper really, I would say, brought me kind of rethinking or to rethink some of my understandings on Yiddishism and the similarity, you probably will be surprised to hear this, to Hebraism in that regard. That is the issue of what you call Baal Tshuva, okay? The idea that someone who comes out of the imagined, people and goes back to the people, but as a matter of fact, he invents it and creates it in a kind of an ideological minded or cultural minded, totally non-Jewish, if you like, external manner. And I think the story of Max Weinreich is much telling, but I had in mind when I read your story some ideas about Vladimir Jabotinsky, for example, in Odessa, who had the same way, if you like, towards Hebraism and later on Zionism. Okay, what's the difference after all, structurally speaking? I would say, but of course, they wouldn't agree with each other on ideological terms. And last but not least, your statement about the place of German, which I think should be expanded in your study on Weinreich to the issue of Yiddish and German in early modern and modern Eastern European Jewish history, because actually what we see here is just, if you like, the tip of the iceberg of a ongoing story of Loshen Ashkenaz, you know, the language that at the same time for Jewish acculturated bourgeoisie in Eastern Europe served as a model, not only in Riga or in the Baltics, rather all over Eastern Europe. Never forget it. German was the way Maskilim wanted to repair, if you like, or to reform Yiddish, okay? And on the other hand, the attitude of German Jews and Germanized Jews to Yiddish, which was also something that is go back to earlier generations, having to do with identity and integration. So, thank you very much for this.